So next up we have a pre-recorded session from Ash Mann, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. And he's going to be talking about Beyond the Promise, what digital failures reveal about the cultural sector's readiness for change. So that should be magic.
Hello everyone, greetings from a very foggy Gothenburg on the west coast of Sweden. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak to you today. My name's Ash and I'm a consultant that works with cultural organisations on digital things that usually involves products, strategies, ways of working. I've been working on digital projects of all kinds for about the last 20 years now and have held roles in-house, in agency leadership and now as a consultant. And in April this year, I launched Beyond the Promise, which is a report looking at why so many digital projects in the cultural sector fall short and what we can learn from that. It's based on sector-wide survey responses, so actual stories of how digital projects have failed or fallen short. And it was written for the people doing, funding, involved in and leading digital work. Now, I carried out this research and wrote the report because over the years I've worked on hundreds of digital projects and I talk about this stuff a lot all the time. And it felt like more recently, over the last couple of years, the conversations I've been having about digital as a thing feel like they've changed slightly. They've become more tired, they felt more frustrated. There was agreement that digital matters, absolutely, but also a shared sense that it rarely delivered on what it promised, hence the report's title. And I was hearing versions of this story from museums in Europe, from theatres in Australia, from freelancers, agencies, funders, people working in organisations. And it started to feel like there was maybe this hidden epidemic of failure that wasn't dramatic, but a quieter, sort of more demoralising form of failure. And I wondered if trying to identify and name some of those patterns might help us to recognize them and hopefully be able to change them. And that feels particularly urgent right now as we navigate AI, algorithmic systems, and a rapidly changing landscape. It feels like understanding why things fail might help us to, in turn, understand how ready we are for what's coming next. And how we might actually be able to seize the tech in a way that feels meaningful and sustainable. In the call for session submissions, the brief talked about a sort of golden time for digital creativity. And in many ways, it absolutely is. There are these incredibly impressive tools, which are often free or very cheap to use, that are really powerful. AI can generate images, video, write copy, build interfaces faster than has ever been possible. But as Christopher Butler recently wrote, anyone can now make something that looks designed, but that doesn't mean that design has happened. The tools make execution really, really accessible, but they don't ask you what you want someone to do. They're not interested in intent. They don't force you to make hard choices about priorities. And I think these aren't only technology or practice questions. These often map onto fundamental questions about purpose, clarity, and responsibility. And they're exactly the questions that surfaced when I was looking at this question of digital failure. Because digital failure isn't usually about the technology. And that was the heart of what I found in the research. Most digital projects that I heard about did not fail because of technology problems. They failed because of misalignment, because of a lack of clarity, or because of structural issues inside an organization. And there were 5 challenges that came up again and again. Firstly, the issue of speed came up repeatedly. I heard that projects were pushed forward quickly, and often this was before the basics were in place. So that meant that things like purpose had not been clarified, success hadn't been defined, but already the deadlines were fixed and in place. And I heard that this urgency was rarely able to be questioned because it was coming from funding cycles or leadership pressure or internal politics. So whilst it might have felt necessary or at the very least non-negotiable. It wasn't leaving any room to plan or align or be able to adapt. And one response that we heard from put it very simply and very diplomatically, saying the short time scale had a negative impact on the outcome, because when there's no time to think, there's not really any time to build things that are going to last. And when you're in a rush, misalignment can take root really early, and it's incredibly difficult to recover from that. Next, I heard that clarity was often missing from the very start. And that meant that goals weren't just unclear, they were often left completely unspoken or understood very differently by each stakeholder on the project. People described deliverables being defined mid-project and success criteria shifting or changing entirely as the work progressed. And without a shared definition of what success looks like, alignment becomes impossible because teams pull in different directions and priorities clash, and it becomes really hard to know when or even if a project is ever finished. And that kind of ambiguity doesn't just delay delivery, it also drains energy and drains trust and drains momentum. The next issue we heard about was around leadership, and leadership was often described as being present in name but absent in practice. And in many cases, leadership support consisted of approving a budget but not really staying engaged in the work beyond that. And respondents talked about leaders who signed off on projects without really understanding what the projects involved, or leaders who disappeared when difficult decisions needed to be made. Sometimes we heard leadership changed entirely mid-project, and sometimes leaders backed competing priorities. And we also heard that sometimes it was obvious that the leaders simply didn't believe in the work, which left teams sort of having to push against the tide. And this lack of alignment at the top had real consequences in delays, demoralization, and projects that lost momentum or direction. What we also heard was that digital teams aren't just busy, they are totally overwhelmed. Again and again, I heard about people covering too many roles with too little support. Sometimes it was a single person expected to handle strategy, delivery, internal comms, and training all at the same time. Now, I've been that person, and it's really, really difficult. And what I heard was that kind of overstretch wasn't only common, it was becoming normalized and even praised. But behind that overperformance was exhaustion. People described working evenings and constantly firefighting just to keep things going. And the consequences of that resilience were perhaps sadly predictable in rush delivery, limited or zero space for reflection, and workarounds that were really just masking deeper issues. And lastly, we heard that when digital projects stumbled, the instinct was often to move on as quickly as possible. But what that meant is there was rarely a moment to pause, to work out what had actually happened or what might need to change next time. And several respondents described projects that failed quietly. There was no debrief, no reflection, just silence. And in that silence, the same issues reappeared again and again. And as a result, people lost confidence, not just in the project, but in digital as a whole. Because without space to make sense of what happened, digital work becomes harder to defend, harder to fund, and in turn, harder to improve. Now, none of these issues are new, but what this work has shown is they're incredibly widespread and they overlap and compound each other. And they weren't isolated. They were coming from large institutions and small teams, different art forms, different types of organizations, different countries, but the patterns were the same again and again. And what this means is that this is the cycle we get stuck in. And as a result, people get frustrated, people leave, and digital becomes harder to advocate for, progress stalls, impact evaporates. But I think perhaps failure isn't the problem. It's the silence that follows failure that we heard about that does the damage. The silence that exists when failure is framed as unacceptable or when it's stigmatized or when it's denied. Because what we heard wasn't people being incompetent or careless. This was people doing their best in conditions that had set them up to struggle. And yet, when things went wrong and when failure isn't part of the conversation, the instinct was for individuals to internalize it, to treat it as a personal failing rather than a structural one. And it seems that when projects fail, we rarely talk about why or what that says about the ways that we work. And this pattern isn't unique to the survey that I ran. Dr. Susan Osman's research after a 2-year placement at DCMS pointed to the same thing, that failure, especially in public and cultural contexts, often becomes a silent, private burden. But naming it and admitting that it exists feels like the first step towards being able to do something constructive about it. Because otherwise, in that context, a context where failure goes unacknowledged or is framed as something to avoid at all costs, it starts to have a really tangible and negative and corrosive impact. And I think these are some of the costs of not talking about failure. We lose momentum, we lose trust, and we lose people, not just in people leaving our organizations, but in the quiet quitting. That's when people stop suggesting ideas, stop being proactive, stop showing initiative. Because when failure isn't acknowledged or accepted as part of work, it can create the conditions for more of it. And one quote in one of the responses really stuck out because I think it illustrated something that was repeated again and again. When the project doesn't go to plan, or even when it does, rather than reflect, we move on as quickly as possible. And I think that's the cycle that we really have to try and break. But before we talk about solutions, it's maybe worth asking what this tells us about ourselves, about our structures, our behaviors, our assumptions, because I think that digital work, perhaps more than any other type of work, reflects the strengths and the weaknesses of the organizations doing it. Because if you're clear, if you're really good at collaborating, if you really understand your audiences, then your digital work will usually be really, really effective. However, if you're misaligned, confused, inwardly focused, bad at making decisions, then those factors are going to be amplified immeasurably in any digital projects that you undertake. So I think there are perhaps 6 shifts that we need to start making, or in some cases, keep making, if we want our digital work to be more sustainable, more successful, and frankly, less demoralizing. Firstly, I think we need to change how we think about and talk about failure. Failure itself is not a verdict, it is a signal. So instead of brushing it aside or internalizing it, we need to start treating it as usable data. It's something to reflect on, to talk about, to learn from. And that could start with trying to frame it with questions like, we tried something, it didn't work as we expected. What can we learn from it? The next shift, and this sounds basic, but it was a common blind spot. Before you commission a tool, hire a supplier, or apply for funding, stop and ask, what are we really trying to achieve? How will we know if it's been successful? And perhaps most importantly, do we all have the same answer to these questions? Because if you can't answer these questions clearly, it's probably too early to start. Now, this isn't a new call, but what the research really highlighted is that digital, in inverted commas, can probably no longer be one person's job or a completely separate set of concerns. It touches programming, comms, operations, fundraising, and that means it should really become embedded in how decisions are made, how success is defined, how teams are working together. That might start by digital voices being invited into strategy conversations, not only delivery conversations, but also by inviting perspectives from across an organization into digital conversations. Now, this next shift is about sustainability, a great launch is meaningless if there's no plan to just sustain it beyond that point. That means money, time, skills, and a realistic view of what is required post go live. So that might mean you have to do less initially, but you will then be able to sustain that work better for longer. I think learning can't be something we only do when things go wrong. So things like regular small check-ins, asking what's working, what's not working, can help to surface issues much earlier, and in doing so, reduce the cost of fixing them later. It can also help to start and sustain more productive, more constructive conversations about the work. And I would really encourage all organizations to make a bit of space for these moments, because in my experience, even a regular 15 minutes can make a real impact. And lastly, it's about culture, about teams being able to do their best work when they have clarity, trust, and autonomy. And that means trying to break down or at least address silos, sharing ownership, and making sure people are supported, because good digital work is inherently multidisciplinary. All the best projects are the result of diverse perspectives and skill sets. And I think we need to acknowledge that and proactively create the conditions for this type of work to be possible. Now, these 6 changes aren't quick fixes, but they're perhaps cultural shifts that we can all have a role in nudging into place project by project. It's not going to be one big leap or one silver bullet that's going to solve all of this. It's going to be a series of incremental steps in the right direction. And perhaps if there's one takeaway, it's this: failure is inevitable, especially when you're doing complex, creative work with limited time, money, and clarity. But the real damage doesn't come from when things go wrong. It comes from pretending that they didn't. When we skip the reflection, when we try to move on too quickly, we lose the chance to learn and we lose the lessons. And in doing so, we lock ourselves into making the same mistakes and again, and we make it harder for the next team coming along to be able to succeed. So being honest about what has happened, even when it's uncomfortable, is how we get better. It's how we build trust, and it's how we stop digital work becoming a cycle of disappointment. So if something didn't go to plan, say so and try to learn from it. Because not everything needs to be groundbreaking or perfect, but it does need to teach us something. So that might look like small experiments, being able to really identify lessons, and having much more honest conversations, because we maybe don't need more stuff. We don't need more tools or platforms or technology. I think what we do need are better ways of working that actually support the people doing the work. So that's structures that make alignment possible, processes that actually create clarity, and language that brings people in rather than shuts them out. And I think that's where the real change is needed. It's in the conditions we work in. So that's it from me. You can read the report, access tools on my website. Everything is free to use and is there to support the conversations you're already having or maybe struggling to start. Thanks so much.